What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some patch highlights for patch 1.2 in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. And this one is quite large, and it does a whole host of different things, including building on some of the changes from the last patch in terms of overall game balance and addressing how things like extra turns work. With that in mind, I want to say towards the beginning of the video, I have seen some reports of people having a few different problems with this specific patch, though they've already rolled out a hotfix to address at least a little bit of that, which had to do with some lines of dialogue being changed to just the word hidden, but that's mostly been addressed at this point. But another thing to keep in mind, though, is that with this particular game, mods are absolutely going to have an effect on things like bugs experienced and whatnot. So if you're using something like, say, Toybox, you need to update that. And if you're still having problems afterwards, you just send in a bug report with, I believe it's Alt-B in-game. That said, this patch is gigantic. So let's talk about some of the stuff it's trying to do, which comes down to things like a sweeping balance pass, I would say, that touched things like extra turns, but also psychers, pyromancy, while also bringing things like quality of life changes, updated dialogues, fixes to dialogues, addressing some of the problems with end slides that could occur, updates to the rumor system, which was a sort of natural way to discover quests and hidden things, updates and tweaks to cutscenes and animations to make them more fluid, alongside the whole host of typical bug fixes that you would expect. Now, in terms of bugs in particular, I just want to mention, if you haven't played this game a little bit since it released back in last December, they've pretty much already fixed all of the critical stuff. That is to say, a lot of the game-breaking things that were found in the Heretic and Iconoclast playthroughs, on top of at least a couple of the companion quests that could bug out as well. So most of these bug fixes were much more specific things like individual abilities or how they were scaling with things. With that said, though, let's get into the exciting stuff first. All the mechanical and balance changes that you would very likely want to know about. And it's probably worth mentioning right here that once you fire up the game, because of the sweeping changes they've made, they said they added a one-time free respec to your character's abilities that you should be able to activate to reset everything, as opposed to having to pay for one on your ship's bridge. Now, the first thing I want to talk about in terms of mechanical changes is what they've done to pyromancy and psychers. In particular, the sort of caster version of pyromancy has been greatly buffed. That is to say, all of your abilities are going to do a lot more damage now, which is mainly because it was the intended damage psyker path, and it was frankly a little bit underwhelming. And as a result of this, most people used it specifically as a buff to more melee-oriented builds where you could kind of pull off a lot of fun combos, but essentially what they've done here is increased the damage of the base Ignite ability, which by extension has increased the damage of a bunch of other abilities that utilize and spread your Ignite damage to other enemies. And while I could go into the math of how they've adjusted all of this, the long and short of it is simply that pyromancy got huge buffs, and if you want to play a sort of space wizard throwing fireballs, that's a much more viable way to play the game now, which is especially important because of this next change, which is the fact that they reined in a lot of the extra turns. Now, they've already done a little bit of this in the previous patch, and if you're just completely unaware of what I'm talking about, basically the most effective way to play this game was to capitalize on extra turns, from the officer class in particular, but also a couple of other ways. And you could do this to the point where if you did it really effectively, the enemy just rarely even got a turn at all. So they wanted to make some changes there to make combat a little more compelling in terms of both the extra turns you could get, but also the overall scaling of things. Now, in particular, what I'm talking about there for the scaling is that a lot of abilities had multiplicative scaling, which basically means as the game went on, they could stack to ridiculous heights, and they wanted to rein a lot of that in and gave a lot of those abilities flat bonuses instead of multiplicative ones. Now, the goal of these changes is to effectively make those abilities more useful in the early game, so in the first few acts you should technically feel stronger if everything went to plan. However, the multiplicative nature of them that was causing them to just go crazy in the late game should be reined in, and you won't progress quite as substantially over the course of the title. And that, combined with some of the changes to the extra turns, should make combat a little more balanced, let's say. Now, in particular, when it comes to the extra turns, though, the Seize the Initiative ability from the Officer archetype now no longer grants an extra turn. Rather, it gives allies under the Voice of Command effect extra damage against enemies that haven't taken a turn yet. Whereas something like In the Hero's Footsteps provides a stacking bonus to your Fellowship or your toughness based on when they use a heroic act or desperate measures ability. So you kind of get the idea of what they were doing there, but we're still not done yet because they've also made a few changes to navigator abilities, which basically means Cassia. Essentially what they did here was change a lot of the math once again, with some of that being buffs and other parts of it being nerfs. But honestly, I doubt you'll see a huge difference in gameplay there. Now, another archetype that saw a lot of changes, though, was the Arch-Militant. If you're familiar with this, basically they can build up stacks of versatility based off the attacks they use, which then grant them stacking bonuses that were one of the things that were scaling to crazy levels. And they kind of reined some of that in to make your initial stacks of versatility give more, with subsequent stacks kind of falling off a little bit and not giving you as much crazy stuff. Now, another cool thing they added, though, was actually a few talents aimed at increasing the viability of dual-wielding melee weapons, such as Dual Weapon Specialist or Scissor Strike. Scissor Strike allowing you to deal damage from both of your melee weapons if you're dual-wielding, so that's something to keep in mind. But a few other minor tweaks. In addition to the pyromancy changes, they also adjusted the levels at which you would increase your psi rating as a sanctioned psyker, giving you access to better abilities faster, which is a nice change in general. But speaking of the Arch-Militant earlier, they also made sure that psychic powers are now counting as different types of attacks for the sake of versatility stacks, to give a little more interplay between those two things now as well, which I thought was a really cool thing that I'm likely going to try myself when the DLC drops in August. Now, honestly, that's just the major stuff. They did also make a significant amount of changes to other abilities, but these were mostly fixes to things like the descriptions and whatnot. Still got a few other things to talk about, though. For instance, all of the items they changed. For starters, they added a ton of icons to all of the items to help them be a little more distinct from each other. They also fixed a fair few items just not working, or in other cases, they adjusted some effects and values. So nothing really stands out to me there in terms of individual pieces, but you might notice some small tweaks to individual items. Now, another cool thing this patch does, though, is, according to Owlcat, hundreds of fixes and changes to locations across the game, including updated visuals, collision detection, and navigation. In particular, the aim of a lot of these changes was to allow Space Marines easier navigation and movement through areas, but also just little stuff like making certain items or interactables just a little easier to access, that kind of stuff, which is probably also a good time to mention all the changes they made to animations, just kind of cleaning them up a little bit. In particular, though, they added animations to a lot of pyromancy powers, so that kind of goes hand in hand with the changes they made. So hopefully that'll even look a little cooler for you now. But then we have the quality of life changes. A lot of fantastic stuff here. For instance, you can sort all of your cargo bays by the vendor you are talking to, meaning that it will be very easy to simply give the best cargo to hand over to individual vendors for reputation, as opposed to having to scroll through it. Another cool one is that you can now access the galaxy map from your palace on Dargonis, instead of having to move through like 2 different maps to get back to your ship to access the galaxy map when you happen to be at your home base. So that was just a fantastic little change that I will definitely enjoy. But I think that'll just about do it for this particular video. So overall, honestly, pretty massive patch for this game. A lot of changes in there, and I think most of all, it's probably going to be how much people enjoy the balance changes from this one that sees how it comes out in the wash, so to speak, which I imagine is probably why they dropped this just a little bit ahead of their DLC come the start of August, rather than dropping it at the same time, though there will likely also be a patch alongside that as well. But that is pretty much going to do it for today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know what you think about all these changes down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, and subscribe. In my case, at the very least, I'm definitely looking forward to checking out the changes to Pyromancy and Arch-Militant and seeing how I could maybe combine those two, because that sounds super fun to me. But in any event, that's pretty much going to do it for me. ability. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.